Hi, and welcome to our second episode of the Literary Lamppost podcast, where we analyse books and see what we can learn from them that we can then apply to real-world problems.
I'm Caitlin. I'm working on my master's in mathematics, but I did my undergrad in English, and I love reading and analysing literature.
And I'm Ashley. I'm an assistant editor for a magazine and a writer. Today we are going to be talking about Little Women, which is a pretty well-known classic. There are a lot of people who have interacted with it in some way, either read the book when they were kids or watched the movie, but maybe haven't thought about it for a long time or haven't really dug deep into it. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at each sister, and some of the topics we're going to be talking about are how society would like us to think that wealth equals happiness. We're going to touch a little bit on women's roles in the late 1800s. We're going to talk about mental health and physical health issues and how today's scene compares to what it was like back then, as well as how our consumeristic and individualistic society impacts how people view morality.
All right, shall we do a really quick recap of the book?
Yeah, so it's a coming-of-age story. It details the lives of these four sisters who make friends with the neighbour boy, Laurie. And it's about how they go through life while their father is fighting in the ongoing civil war. As the title might imply, it's about these girls learning to become women in their society.
Something cool that I noticed right at the beginning of the book is the way that Louisa May Alcott uses the book Pilgrims Progress as a framing device for the rest of the story.
Right, so Pilgrims Progress is a famous Christian book published by John Bunyan in 1678, and it's written as an allegory for the Christian life. It's the story of a young man and his journey to get to the celestial city, which represents heaven, and along the way he encounters all sorts of challenges and meets many people, some who help him, others who really don't, and all the way through his journey he carries a burden on his back.
And there's a reference very early in the book where the sisters are reflecting on their childhood when they would play Pilgrim's Progress, and they would start in the cellar and have bundles on their backs, and they'd make their way through the house and finally climb to the top of the stairs where the celestial city was, and they would watch their bundles tumble down the stairs, which is analogous to something that happens in the book.
And now that they're older, they talk about the fact that they have real burdens, which are their struggles in their daily life. And at the outset of the book, they all make this commitment to carrying their burdens in a meaningful way. And that really does shape the way that the rest of the book is written. What's also interesting is that at the time when this book was written, there wasn't much children's literature. And the children's literature that was written always had a very clear moral.
So I remember my English teacher in high school talking about this, thank you Miss Wright. The word that was used to describe children's literature at the time was didactic, meaning it was meant to teach a lesson. So while Little Women is very heartwarming and entertaining and a really feel-good story, it also has some pretty clear moral lessons that it seems like Louisa May Alcott was really eager to share.
We're going to go through all four sisters, talk a little bit about their burdens and how it plays out in the rest of the book.
Let's start with Meg, the oldest. How would we describe Meg?
Well, Meg is 17 and she's very much a little lady. Because she is the oldest, she remembers a time when her family had money. She remembers better than her younger sisters do. And now their family is poorer because of some of the bad financial decisions their father made. So Meg feels very disadvantaged that she has to live without the many beautiful things she sees other more wealthy girls having. So we would say that this is her burden, that she wishes for things that she can't have. And it doesn't help that she's working as a governess for some children in a really wealthy family, and the older sisters in that family, who are about her own age, are out in society. You know, they're wearing fine silks and have a lot of pretty things, and Meg doesn't get to be a part of that, and she finds that really hard.
Yeah, she complains about it quite a bit, hey. She often talks about how dreadful it is to be poor and how she wishes she could have all these pretty things that the other girls around her have. The defining main chapter for Meg in this book is when she gets to spend 2 weeks with her rich friends Annie and Sally Moffat. And it's very, very clear what Louisa May Alcott thinks about quote-unquote being rich, because she presents very wealthy people as relatively vapid and not really caring about deep things. There's this quote about the Moffats. It says, "The Moffats were very fashionable, and simple Meg was rather daunted at first by the splendour of the house and the elegance of its occupants. But they were kindly people, in spite of the frivolous life they led, and soon put their guest at ease. Perhaps Meg felt, without understanding why, that they were not particularly cultivated or intelligent people, and that all their gilding could not quite conceal the ordinary material of which they were made." And the theme is echoed in other sections of the book, where Louisa May Alcott doesn't put a lot of value on being wealthy and says it's much better to find joy in the things that money can't buy. But when Meg goes to the Moffat's house for a period of time, her mother is quite worried that she will be dissatisfied with her home life afterwards. And this does actually kind of seem to be true at the beginning, when Meg reflects that home now looked bare and dismal as she thought of it, work grew harder than ever, and she felt that she was a very destitute and much injured girl in spite of the new gloves and silk stockings. And that is quite apt, because just 2 pages earlier, she actually remarks that it does seem that the more one gets, the more one wants. So it's interesting that this plays out exactly how she herself described it only a couple pages earlier.
One evening, while Meg is at the Moffat's house, feeling very out of place with what she has to wear compared to the other girls, there's a party. The other girls feel sorry for her and lend her a silk dress in the newest fashion with expensive jewellery, and they put makeup on her, and for one night she gets to pretend to be one of them. At first she's thrilled, but ultimately she finds that it's not as satisfying as she thought it would be. She ends up feeling really silly and shallow. The next door neighbour boy, Laurie, is invited to this party, and when he sees her, he comments that it's not like her, that he doesn't think that it's true to her personality.
Yeah, and she kind of realises the shallowness of all this wealth and riches and parties and frivolity, and she realises that she actually is much more deeply happy at home.
And, that's true for us still today. There have been quite a few studies done on the correlation between wealth and happiness. We're going to touch on a couple of them. There was one done in 2003, which showed that happiness increased with wealth, but it capped at about 75,000 USD, which is about 100,000 today, accounting for inflation.
But doing a bit more research, there actually seems to be a little bit more to the story. So according to a more recent study, happiness grows alongside income, and it doesn't cap out at any particular point, because as income increases, so does the capacity for more family time and leisure time and taking vacations, and all of those things did add positively to happiness. However, the catch is that only applied to people who were already happy. It seems like that there's a paradox here, because the study found that the greater your goal for financial success, the lower your satisfaction with family life, friendships, and jobs, regardless of the household income. And in my experience as a teacher at school, there's a lot of kids who say, when I ask them what they want to do with their lives, what do they see for themselves, their number one answer is get rich.
Well, that's what society is continually promoting. Social media, advertisements, the internet in general endorses this idea that wealth equals happiness, even though there have been these studies which have shown that that's not quite true. There's also widespread acknowledgement of the negative impacts of materialism, yet it still dominates so much of our culture.
Well, it is true that to a point wealth does make your life easier, which can lead to happiness, but chasing wealth and wanting more and more and more, like it seems like Meg does in our book, doesn't actually lead to all that much more happiness. It doesn't help that some of the most famous people in the world are ultra-wealthy billionaires, and they're in the online space a lot, and they make it seem like their life is something that we should aspire to.
I guess we have to remember that we only see a small portion of their lives. They're wealthy, they want to show off. If they're unhappy, they're not going to show it. And so watching them, we get this idea that unhappiness disappears when we can just get everything that one person has. And bringing it back to Meg, we really see how she grows throughout the year that this book covers. After her stay at her friend's house, she comes home and has some pretty serious talks with her mother and sister about this, and we can see it really made an impression on her. At the end, she's being courted by a very poor man, and a rich aunt tells her off and basically says, "I wanted better for you. He's poor, you can't marry him." And Meg says, "I'm not afraid of being poor, for I've been happy so far."
I love that quote. So Meg's character growth really starts out with her wanting to be rich, wanting more money, wanting things that she feels like she can't have.
And in the end, she discovers that she can be content with the little that she has, and the things that she really values aren't actually things that can be bought with money. As her mother says, "But I know by experience how much genuine happiness can be had in a plain little house."
All right, sister number 2, Jo, short for Josephine. She's the second oldest and she's 15.
Yeah, 15 at the start. She does turn 16 during the book.
Jo's major burden through the course of this book is the societal limitations that are placed on women at the time.
She's so dissatisfied with the role that she has to play as a girl.
And she often wishes that she was a boy, especially very close to the beginning of the book. She says, "It's bad enough to be a girl anyway when I like boys' games and work and manners. I can't get over my disappointment in not being a boy. And it's worse now than ever, for I'm dying to go and fight with Papa, and I can only stay at home and knit like a poky old woman." This is, of course, in reference to the Civil War.
Interestingly, author Louisa May Alcott herself wanted to go fight in the war, but it wasn't allowed because she was a woman, and so she actually went as a nurse instead. Jo talks about boy games, which include a lot of running. She loves to run, and everyone's always telling her it's not ladylike. She likes boys' manners. She likes to whistle and put her hands in her pockets, which, that's obviously something that we as girls do quite often today. But back then, it was not proper for a girl. Jo really hated these restraints that were put on her. Now, before we go on, we do need to explain something. Those of you who are familiar with the storyline from the film, it all seems to be one book, but it is actually 2 books. The second book is titled Good Wives, and this is where the girls grow up, get older, and get married. But it is usually to the discretion of the publisher whether or not to publish it as 1 book or 2. Often in Australia and the UK, it gets published as 2, and in America, 1. So if you do decide to read Little Women and get to the end and feel like, wait, where's the rest of the story? Then just know that there is more, and it's in a book called Good Wives.
So back to Jo. Jo wants to be a writer. We see her writing plays for her sisters to act out and then writing stories. Now, something that's really, really interesting about Jo's character arc, and we don't actually find this out until the second book where she marries a professor, but this was actually not something that Louisa May Alcott intended for Jo. Alcott wanted Jo to become what she called a literary spinster, which was a woman who was able to support herself through her writing and chose not to marry. Jo actually says at one point in the earlier parts of her life, "I don't believe I shall ever marry. I'm happy as I am, and I love my liberty too well to be in any hurry to give it up for any mortal man." But the publisher objected to this and required that Alcott make Jo get married in the end. And I think that's a pretty apt commentary on the expectations placed on women at the time.
In Greta Gerwig's recent adaptation in 2019, which is, by the way, phenomenal, go watch it now, she has a really poignant scene with Jo and her mother. Things have changed for Jo, she's grown up, her sisters have moved on, and she says, "Women, they have minds and they have souls as well as just hearts, and they've got ambition and they've got talent as well as just beauty. I'm so sick of people saying that love is just all a woman is fit for. I'm so sick of it, but I'm so lonely." I think this is something a lot of women can relate to today, because we have all these goals for our life and sometimes it feels like they contradict each other, and we have influencers telling us to either be boss babes or trad wives, and it can actually be really hard to figure out the path we want our lives to take.
I think that sums up Louisa May Alcott's intentions pretty well in trying to critique the society that her characters and ultimately herself are placed in. So we've come so far as a society, and we have women in the military now. They can go and fight if they want to. And we have women who have careers and they aren't confined to staying home and looking after the household and children. They actually have options in their life, and that's really, really good. But there are still some challenges in our society today that show that there is some real work that we still need to do. For example, in Australia, there still is a national gender pay gap, and this, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is 11.5%. So that means over the course of a year, women can earn up to $12,000 less than men. And this is accounting for all those things that are usually used to quote-unquote debunk the wage gap, so like working part-time to take care of children or overtime or things like that. But even when you take those factors out, we still have this gender pay gap. And some of that is explained by the fact that lower paying industries are female dominated. And there's higher paying industries, for example, computer science. Only 11% of graduates in computer science are women. So there is still a ways to go in this society. I know in my own personal experience, I was actually discouraged from going into the sciences because I was told that it would be a male-dominated space and it would be hostile to me as a woman. Don't get me wrong, we've made massive, massive strides towards equality, and that is fantastic, but it's really important to have an awareness that there are still some of these issues. And Jo is a really good example of how to push back against these stereotypes and making progress.
Yeah, because she wants to make a place for herself in society that is not dictated by what everyone is telling her to do. And that's why I think here we are, 150 years later, still reading this book and still identifying with Jo as a character and wanting to embody her spirit of not conforming to these societal pressures around her.
A complete opposite character to Jo is her younger sister, Beth.
Beth, short for Elizabeth, is just a beautiful soul. She's described as the peacemaker of the family. She's 13 at the start of the book and she has severe anxiety. Of course, it's not called that in the book, being written in 1868, but we can definitely see that that is what she has. And when the sisters talk about their Pilgrims Progress burdens, Beth says that one of her burdens is being afraid of people. I can kind of relate to that. At one point, Beth says that during her birthday, she didn't want anyone looking at her while she was opening her presents. It reminds me of myself. I think it was at my 4th birthday party when everyone started singing and I crawled under the table.
Yeah, that definitely was you.
Beth was also so shy she could barely leave the house. The book says that she learns at home because, and I quote, she was too bashful to go to school. It had been tried, but she suffered so much that it was given up, and she did her lessons at home.
And nowadays we have a little bit of this commentary saying, oh, these mental health issues, they're all new. Nobody used to have them. Well, they actually did. They just ended up suffering in silence. It wasn't really talked about. And Beth was very loved and accepted within her family, but she didn't really get to interact with the wider world all that much. She was mostly housebound for a lot of her growing up years because she was too afraid to go out and be with people. So, you know me, I'm very much about numbers and maths, and so of course I looked up the statistics. I'm assuming there's going to be some differences in different places, but in Australia, the statistics are that 17% of Australians have anxiety. So that's roughly 1 in 5, which is pretty high.
I would like to point out that there is research into the fact that anxiety is increasing. Studies show that social media, for example, is responsible for aggravating mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. Another factor is media overload. With the internet today, we have so much news at our fingertips. We hear a lot of bad things constantly that are going on around the world, and that does contribute to rises in anxiety. But back when Little Women was written, they didn't have social media or media overload, yet there still were plenty of mental health problems. They had different challenges back then.
Yeah, and I mean, society is much improved in many ways, but there are definitely unique challenges in today's age which do affect our mental health differently. However, recognizing those things and seeking treatment, whether they be medication or regular therapy, and ways to manage that can be really helpful. And I think if those resources had been available to Beth, it would have drastically improved her life.
And Beth does overcome part of her anxiety. She's able to make friends with the neighbor boy Laurie, who lives in this big mansion with his grandfather, Mr. Lawrence. And the girls think that Mr. Lawrence is kind of scary at the start, but they slowly warm up to him and he becomes a good friend for the family. But Beth was a lot slower to warm up to him. Now, Beth loves music. She loves playing the piano. And in Mr. Lawrence's mansion, he has a really nice piano, and he invites Beth to come over and play. But he does it so incredibly gently, assuring her she won't be in the way and that no one will listen to her, and she's encouraged to take those steps outside her comfort zone. Mr. Lawrence and Laurie make sure to keep the servants away when she's playing, so she doesn't have to run into anyone or have to talk to anyone. And I think that's so important for people with anxiety. Speaking as someone who has struggled with anxiety, to not just throw them in the deep end. You can make little allowances for them, small steps to overcoming something terrifying, while at the same time encouraging them to step outside of their little bubble of comfort.
That's really important. And even if it's tiny steps, it's important to celebrate those steps.
Yeah, all Beth did was go next door. And for her, that was huge. And she was celebrated for doing so. It mattered to her, and so it mattered to her family. And they supported her, and they cheered her on. Honestly, Beth is so incredibly loved in this book.
She is. And I think one of the reasons that she is because she is so incredibly kind. There was one section of the book that really stood out to me because it was talking about how kind and gentle Beth was with her dolls.
Oh yeah, Beth does love her dolls, and she takes the ones that her sisters no longer play with. Meg and Jo are already too old for dolls, but Amy, the youngest, casts away her dolls if they're too old or if they're too ugly, and Beth gathers them up into her arms and dresses them, takes them for walks and talks to them.
And there's one doll that has no arms or legs, so she wraps it up in a blanket and puts it into a little bed and she takes it outside for air. Just shows so much love and kindness for these little outcasts. And I imagine that that is how she would interact with genuine outcasts of society as well.
And that's actually shown a little bit later on in the book when the girls join Laurie and some other friends from England one day, and they go out on the river and play games, and Beth was initially like, I'm not going to be talking to anybody, especially not the boys. And everyone's like, oh, it's okay, you don't have to talk to the boys. But then the boy that she does end up talking to is a boy who's disabled, who can't run and play like the other boys. He just sits there and watches them sadly. And Beth actually sits near him and starts talking to him, and the others are amazed that she's talking to one of the boys. Alcott writes of Beth that there are many Beths in the world, shy and quiet, sitting in the corners till needed, and living for others so cheerfully that no one sees the sacrifices till the little cricket on the hearth stops chirping and the sweet sunshiny presence vanishes, leaving silence and shadow behind.
And this, of course, is talking about Beth's struggle with illness, which she never quite recovers from, and she does ultimately die. And this is a really difficult time for the sisters losing Beth. It is in the second part, but most people who have watched the movies have interacted with this part of the story.
Yeah, and I love what Alcott's saying in this quote, that in the end, people like Beth leave silence and shadow behind them. She's saying that they are still important and they are still loved and they still make a difference on the people around them, no matter how anxious or quiet they might be.
Yeah. So Beth contracts something called scarlet fever, which is a bacterial infection, and it used to be considered a really serious childhood disease.
The reason she contracts it is actually another example of her kindness. Their mother visits a really poor family, brings them food, but when their mother has to go away for a while, she tells the girls to continue going, but none of them go. They all make excuses, and so Beth goes alone every single day. The children in the family, however, got sick, and Beth caught it.
And the book details how she gets very, very sick, and she does recover for a time before ultimately getting sick again later in the story.
In the second book. Yeah, scarlet fever is incredibly contagious. The youngest girl, Amy, is sent away, but because Meg and Joe have already had it in the past and so have the immunity for it, they stay and help take care of Beth.
So, like I mentioned, scarlet fever used to be considered a very serious childhood disease, and it was often fatal, which is really unfortunate. However, now it's treated with antibiotics, so it's no longer considered a really serious childhood disease. But when I was doing my research for this, I was a bit stunned to realize antibiotics were only invented in 1928, so that is less than 100 years.
That's crazy.
From where we are now in 2025. I'm so incredibly thankful for all those medical advances that we have, that our childhood diseases that used to be fatal are no longer fatal. And we take it for granted now that, oh, you get sick with a bacterial infection, you get antibiotics, you'll be just fine. And a lot of these really nasty childhood diseases like smallpox, measles, polio, there are now vaccines for, and thankfully, because of these vaccines, these diseases have almost been eradicated. It's really sad that Beth didn't have antibiotics available to her when she was struggling with this sickness. But despite the fact that Beth ultimately does succumb to scarlet fever, her journey with her burden, making peace with her anxiety and her health, it's a really good example to us.
It definitely is. Amy, on the other hand...
Amy, yes. Amy is the spoiled youngest sister.
So Amy's 12 years old and a very talented artist, actually. In the second book, she goes on to study in Europe. But as a 12-year-old living in New England, she has such burdens. She's a rather proud little thing, rather vain. She cares about her nose a great deal. And she's the only sister who goes to school in their town. She complains that she has to wear her cousin's clothes.
That she has to wear a red bonnet instead of a blue one.
And that she has to wear purple with yellow dots, which, to be fair, is a little bit tragic.
It is.
And the book says that her artistic soul rebels against that. But it also says that her small vanities and selfishnesses were growing nicely.
It's interesting that Alcott takes that approach and specifically names those flaws in Amy.
Yeah, it is. It kind of goes back to her approach of wanting to teach through her writing. And with Amy, there is definitely a lesson to learn. Amy's pride and her vanity and selfishness are picked at throughout the book, and it's considered a fault. And the book gives us the idea that she should be working on this fault. She doesn't for the longest time, and to be fair, she's only 12, and she is the youngest. I do think it's interesting, though, that back in the 18th and 19th and even the beginning of the 20th century, there was more of an emphasis on morality. People worked on their characters back then, but today in literature and in broader society, we don't really see that anymore. Researchers have actually studied this phenomenon, and there actually was a shift around the mid-20th century with society focusing more on consumerism and secularism together with rapid industrialization. Why do you think that there was that shift?
So there's a really good historian that I've been listening to recently. His name is Tom Holland. No, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, a different Tom Holland. He's an English historian and he is secular. He's not religious, but he has talked a fair bit about how Christianity has impacted the morality of our society. I would highly, highly recommend going to find him on YouTube. He has some super interesting things to say. But he talks about how back in the days of the Greeks and the Romans, the morality was essentially just strong beat the weak just have to take it, that's just how it is. There wasn't really a need for being a good person. But there was a shift around the beginning of Christianity towards being good to the people around you, making sure you weren't taking advantage of people. And I think that these things come directly from the teachings of Jesus and trying to embody the characteristics that he modeled. And this really changed the idea of what was important in society. And I think this was a really big reason why there was this idea of working on your character and becoming a better person. When Little Women was written, Christianity was a much bigger part of society in general. Most people in America at the time were Christian. I think it's pretty significant that with the rise of secularism, there's also been a bit of a decline in people thinking about morality and character flaws, etc. And of course, I'm not saying in any way that society must return to Christianity, especially in the sense of government, because any form of religion in the government threatens religious liberty of everybody. So church and state definitely should stay separate, but on a personal level, it's not a bad thing for people to have a good hard look at their characters and see where they need to grow and where they need to improve for the sake of just making life better for themselves.
Well, definitely go check out Tom Holland. It sounds like he's got some really good ideas. So we've been using the word morality. I'd like to talk about the word itself and the definition. It's kind of an old-fashioned word. Today it's often correlated with extreme religious ideals, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it might be worth revisiting because at its core, morality is about what's wrong and what's right. And if being moral means doing what's right, how do we decide what's wrong and what's right?
I think a lot of people would just immediately say, well, Christians can figure out what's wrong and what's right from the Bible. And I say this as a Christian myself, I don't actually think it's that simple. Because sometimes people say that without actually reading and understanding the depth of the ideas in the Bible. And I think it's really important that we use critical thinking about what's wrong and what's right. It seems like a lot of the time the Bible is used to bash other people and their choices rather than to think deeply about your own choices.
Yeah, and I think that we also need to think about some of the things that we can do that are right in the broader world. Maybe taking care of people who are struggling around us, whether because of poverty or injustice, or taking care of the world we live in, caring for the ecosystems and supporting laws in society that do these things well. I've been thinking more recently, it seems like in our society today, which is more secular, more consumeristic, more individualistic, that when given a choice, people will choose money over morality. That is, doing the thing that makes more money rather than doing the right thing.
There's actually a verse that I've been thinking about recently as well from the Bible, and it's from the book of Mark, chapter 8, verse 36. It says, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Anyway, Amy's a really good example of looking introspectively and finding the flaws within you and working on them to improve them, to be a better person and a better member of society.
All right, so those are the 4 sisters and their burdens, and a bit about how they overcome them over the course of this book, and how they are also our burdens in a way.
We hope that we have inspired you to go and read Little Women or watch one of the movies. The most recent film adaptation by Greta Gerwig is absolutely fantastic.
I love it with every part of my being. It's got some really amazing actresses who really bring it to life.
I think that everybody will be able to find a part of themselves reflected in one of the 4 sisters in Little Women.
Whether it be Meg, who struggles with envy,
or Jo, who struggles with the limitations that society has placed on her,
or Beth, who struggles with anxiety,
or Amy, who struggles with selfishness. It's a really inspiring read. We hope that you'll join us next time as we will be diving into a lesser-known part of the Chronicles of Narnia, talking about the last battle.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Literary Lamppost, as well as subscribing on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform to make sure that you don't miss any of our new episodes.
Thanks for listening and see you next time.